Hi everyone and welcome to my talk. My name is Jedidjah Julia Noomen and I will be talking to you today about spoken versus written dialogue, finding the best voice for your characters. While this is a pre-recorded talk, I will be online during the convention to answer any questions afterwards. So feel free to contact me. And if you're watching this at any other moment or you have any questions at any other moment, feel free to find me through the internet and ask me anything you want to ask me. But before you do, you obviously need to know who I am and why I'm talking about this subject to you today. Well, I am a writer and narrative designer. I am originally from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, but working and living all over Europe. I was educated as a writer for theater, and during the first couple of years of my career, I did work in theater, film, and TV. But I slowly made the move into game writing and also into narrative design. Mainly because I was interested in more interactive fiction, interactive writing. I have done interactive theater as well, and I still do. I have been working as a director in theater, which I have also been able to do for video games, directing voice actors, for instance. Over the last couple of years, I worked on several games in several genres. I recently worked on a game called Old Frequencies, which is audio only, so just voices, no images, at least not from speaking characters. Another game I did was the Criminal Minds mobile game, which is obviously a difference between that and All Frequencies because we had no voices, but Criminal Minds, since it is a CBS TV series, we had the likenesses of the characters, and people who know the TV series would probably hear the voices of the actors in their heads. So that's another way of writing voices. I did a mobile game called Heart's Medicine Doctor's Oath, which has no voices at all, just text balloons dialogue. We'll get back to that later. So yeah, basically I did both voiced and non-voiced games. And I am currently working with Asobo Studio, writing for a, at this moment, unannounced game. So, spoken or non-spoken dialogue in games. Let's start first with making a choice, because there are a lot of things to think about when you want to make the choice for either having spoken audio or not having spoken audio. First, obviously, is budget. Recording voices, implementing them, that costs money, basically. So it makes a lot of sense to think about the budget. But that's not all. There are genre and platform conventions. In general, mobile games tend to have less voice acting because a lot of mobile players will play without sound. So you have to think about whether you think you need it for your game. And if you do, and you do it on the mobile platform, how will you explain to your players that the audio is there, the spoken word is there, and it's something that is important to the game? So think about platform conventions, think about genre conventions. And if you want to do something that is different from the convention, make sure you inform your players about that and make sure that they know. Player behavior, that's sort of the same as the conventions. Like I said, mobile is the best example for this. A lot of players will play without sound, even if you explain it. That's not just for spoken dialogue, but also for ambient sounds, music, whatever. You might have seen or worked on mobile games that, for instance, show a text or a logo at the start saying like, this game is going to be better if you turn on the sound, things like that. If you choose to have in-game dialogue, make sure you mention that to your players. Whether it's an existing IP or not is also something that's important. Like I mentioned before, I worked on a Criminal Minds game that was fully endorsed by CBS, so it's an official game. But at the same time, you know, you're not going to get the actors, the original actors, to do the voice acting. And it make no sense to have other actors do that. So on the other hand, you can also have an existing IP that usually, for instance, if it's a gaming IP, that usually would have voices. So how would that work if you don't do voices, for instance? Will people care about that? Will they think about that? Or the other way around, what if you've made like 4 games without voices, and then in the 5th one with the same characters, you start adding voices? Will people appreciate that? Or will it be weird and will it put off people? All sorts of questions that you can think about. Text style is another one. I will be talking mainly about dialogue, but there are different ways of narration, obviously. If you have, for instance, one narrator, it can be really interesting to have that done in voice, because it can really add to the atmosphere. It can add to the whole audio design of the game. And it can be slightly less pricey, fitting into your budget. So think about that text style. What do you have? Do you have dialogues? Do you have a lot of characters? Do you have narration? Does it make sense to do that as a voiceover, or is it more interesting to do it on screen and use the existing lines to just show them and make that interesting? All things that you can think about. Same goes for audio. I already mentioned it. What's your audio design going to sound like? Do you have music? Do you have effects? Would that whole mix benefit from using voices, or maybe not? Think about that as well. And the final one is obviously accessibility, which is a really important one. I mentioned before I worked on a game called Old Frequencies, a game that is fully audio, and we wanted it to be accessible for visually impaired people. But on the other hand, if all you do is make it accessible for that audience, what do you do with people who have hearing disabilities and want to play your game? So how do you make sure that your game is accessible to them as well? Think about that. Think about if you want your game to be accessible to as many players as possible, and hopefully you want to, because that's a really important thing. What will the impact be of having spoken dialogue or non-spoken dialogue? Okay, so you've made your choice. What now? We'll discuss a couple of things that are different between writing for voiced games or non-voiced games. Like I said, I started out in film and theater. So when I went into video games and I started to write my first game that had dialogues without the actors in it, it was quite a step for me, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this talk now, because I realized that there wasn't that much info about the differences between the two, but the differences are big. And I think of spoken versus written dialogue in games like film versus comic book, even if your non-voiced characters move around. So basically, comic book is static. Your game might have moving characters. still, I think the comparison is valid, because when you write for comics, you have the images, but you don't have the sound. So you can use your characters and give them facial expressions. You can use the whole drawing to make choices in where your camera is going to be, your virtual camera. And there's a lot you can do to enhance what they're saying in fonts as well, things like that. But still, you won't be hearing what they're saying. And making that comparison has been really useful for me. We'll discuss characterization, jokes and irony, pacing, tutorials, working with actors, and what do you do when you have a combination of voice and written text. So without further ado, let's continue. Okay, characterization. So if you have a voiced game, you have the sound of an actor, you have speech patterns, and you have vocabulary. Obviously, when you have just the written dialogue, you don't have the sound, you don't hear the actor. But there's things you can do. You can characterize your character by recurring words. So for instance, a lot of people will have certain words that they use often. You can use those. Sentence length. Some people make really long sentences where they talk, others shorter. Vocabulary, again, not just for voice, but also for written. People use certain words. So do they have like a large vocabulary or just a small one? What sort of words do they use? All of those things you can use to characterize the main people in your game. But please don't go overboard. Some things are hard or annoying to read. So for instance, if you have somebody who uses one or two words often, don't put them in every line, because when you read something, and we'll get back to this later, it can be really annoying, even more annoying when people are talking, to just read the same word over and over again. Same goes for sentence length. If somebody talks in really long sentences, it's going to be hard to read, which is why I really advise you to check out some subtitle guidelines. Because even though subtitling for TV and film is always about condensing, they have rules that are all about what is easy to read. So no more than this amount of lines, no more than this amount of words, specific small words that you don't use when you subtitle something. And they give a really good insight into what people find annoying to read or find easy to read. So look up some subtitle guidelines, you can find them online, and inform yourself about it. I have a image from Penelope Garcia from Criminal Minds, the TV series there. Like I said, I did the Criminal Minds game and we didn't have the voice of the actors. But what a good thing was that they have really specific ways of talking, and Garcia is one of the main characters who has that. So for me, it was really nice to be able to try and mimic the way she talked in the written words. So I already had a characterization of her personality, which I could use. And that's something that you can always do, even with characters that you've just made up. Listen to people, hear how they speak, find the patterns, and use them when you write it down. So these are questions you can use. Does my character talk fast or slow? Use big or small words. Ask questions often. Examples, do they exaggerate? And like I already said, just listen, listen, and listen some more. Especially if you don't have a lot of images for your characters, like no cut scenes, for instance, or whatever. it can really help to make sure that your characters have really different ways of talking, just to make a difference between all of them and make them easily recognizable. But I have one caveat, and that's the accent and the dialect. In a voice, you have the dialect, which in this case, I mean a regional or cultural background of the character that you can hear. If you have a voice character, you can also hear the accent. That's something that you can't really catch in written words. It can be really useful to have accents or dialects, but there's a lot of mocking, stereotyping, things like that going on. I have the image of Mario, who is obviously Italian because you can hear it. But we're in 2020 at this moment, and I think that we should have a firm grasp on the difference between using somebody's accent or dialect or misusing it. There's a lot of guesstimating as well. Please, 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 if you write about a character that is from a different region, that you are a different cultural background, ask a native speaker, ask a scholar for advice. Don't guess about how they should sound. Don't copy conventions. There's a lot of that going on. So don't think about like, oh, Mario is Italian and this is how he speaks. So every Italian character could speak like that and we'll just copy that. If we keep copying film, TV, and game conventions, we'll never get to real characters, I think. So do your own research, ask other people to advise you in this, and make sure when you use a dialect or an accent that you use it properly and realistically. Yeah, jokes and irony. And this is a different subject. I just want to touch upon it really fast because it's something that I found was a problem when I went from working with actors to writing dialogue that is just written down. In voice, you have timing, you have inflections, you have body language, you have facial expression, a lot of it. But when you write a joke down, you just have words, basically. And even if you have characters in your game who move around, even if you have motion capture, it's still going to be different. It is. And the inflections, the body language, when you have voiced characters, it's going to be easier, but even then it's harder than just looking at an actor in flesh and blood. When you only have the words on screen and you have drawn characters that have a slight facial expression or a movement, your joke is always going to be harder to get for people, and they will even sometimes mistake about what you mean, especially thinking about irony. So, best tip I have is compare your written words to emails, social media, and other faceless messaging. We all know those moments when you send a text message or an email and you make a joke or you say something with irony. You don't use a winky face and the other person will just be like, wow, this is rude. Wow, you never meant it like that. Well, take that and apply that to your written words in dialogue and think about how people will understand it. You may have to just throw your joke away. You may have to disuse irony or make it clearer than usual. It's not easy, but it will save you a lot of problems later on. Also, one thing as another tip, try to find comedy words or word combinations. A lot of things have been written about this. Comedy words, I've mentioned here the Woody sketch by Monty Python, look it up. It's about how words sound and which words sound funny and which don't. Do some research into that, because that can also help in written words. Some words just look funny, basically. Okay, pacing. This is a big one. As soon as you have characters who are voiced, you decide the pacing. And with you, I mean the writer, the actor, the director, the animator, basically everybody who's working on the story of your game. You decide when an actor says something, how fast they speak. You have the possibility of overlap. So basically somebody saying something and then somebody else interrupting that. Everything can be done. So the pacing is all in your hands. If you have just the written dialogue, it's usually the player who decides. Even if you have lines that are just continuing, most games will have like tap or click to continue the lines. But even if you don't have that, it's still the player who decides, because the player sometimes will pause or even just unfortunately skip a whole dialogue. So ultimately, written words are in the player's hands. Also, there's no overlap possible because people aren't speaking, so you can't like put two sentences together at the same time. So that's also something that will feel less natural. This is really something to think about when you're writing, because this will have a really big impact. And there is a difference in writing for voiced games and for non-voiced games, purely based on pacing. If you would have actors speak your dialogue, you would probably, hopefully, write your lines with a different pacing. And to illustrate that, I want to show you a small clip from Heart's Medicine, Doctor's Oath, mobile game I worked on, which is voiceless. And I will first show you the version that has no voice at all. I have to say, there's usually music in the background, but at this moment I've turned off all the sound. So you will at first hear it without anything. Okay, so that was the original version. As you can see, this is a tap to continue dialogue. So the player decides the pacing, but we have like one line per character in text balloons. And working with the implementing animator on scenes like this really helped me to find the right pacing for a game that has its cutscenes at this way. However, some great fans of this game decided to make a voiced version, and I must say their voiced version is awesome. It's really great. They've asked some actors to work with them, and they've basically done voices for all of the cutscenes of the entire game. And I think it's brilliant. I love that they've done it. So I really want to commend them for doing this and finding like the right voices and the right intentions. However, I find it really tough to look at and listen to, because it confronts me with the fact that I never meant those lines to be done like this. If this had been a voiced video game, I would have definitely written this differently, especially for the pacing. Um, and I will want to show you the same scene now with the voices. And again, please take note of how wonderful the actors are. But I hope at the same time that this will illustrate the difference in pacing between writing for voice dialogue and writing for non-voice dialogue. So try and find the moments where you think like, oh, this is off in pacing, just because this is how the game has been built. So not because the actors are off, but just because this is the way it's been done. And this can be really useful for you if you have no experience in, for instance, writing without voices, to find those differences and get a feel for the differences in pacing.
Do you want some more? Allison?
I'm sorry. It's just...
I get it. It's a struggle to feel welcome in this new hospital. For all of us.
At least you're a licensed doctor. I've never felt more like just an intern. Where are you going?
I thought you could use some cheering up.
World's best doctor.
Oh, well.
Thanks, Daniel. I really needed that.
Hey, we've overcome worse.
Much worse. Like falling off a cliff in an ambulance?
Or performing brain surgery during a fire.
I did like how that ended.
Me too.
Okay, so hopefully you found that useful. Okay, continue on to tutorials. Also something that is a big difference between voiced and written tutorials. Voice tutorials are easier to make diegetic and fun. So diegetic, if you don't know the term, is something that is within the story. So basically, if you have the voices of the characters in your game, it's going to be easier to make the tutorial spoken by those characters and make it really part of the gameplay. It's easier to make fun, but you still need to repeat a lot of things when there's no gameplay of interaction, because players will definitely forget things if they just hear it and don't see it written. So that's why usually tutorials will have both the voiced text and also extra information written, just a tutorial text without any story elements to them, just because there's a lot to remember, and it's always hard to do that when you get a lot of info. So you still will need repeating, but with voice dialogue in tutorials, in general, it's easier to make it fun and diegetic. If you have written tutorials, the player will be bored faster in general. Again, there are definitely examples of exceptions to this, but in general, it's harder to make it fun in written text. Tutorials are already a lot of information, and if it's written on the screen, it can become boring and also hard to read. It can be harder to remember relevant details just because you don't hear any emotion. When you have it voiced, you can put emotion in the tutorials and make it easier for people to remember it. If it's just a whole mess of words, it's going to be harder to remember the details. It can still be useful to have the ability to reread tutorial information or take your own pace. Again, in voice, the pacing is not going to be decided by the player, but mainly by the game developers. So that means that sometimes you might have missed something and you can't repeat it. And in written things, it's easier to just keep your own pace and keep something on the screen. Basically, tutorials is a whole different, interesting subject that I think could be great to have a lot of interesting lectures on. I'll just leave it at this for now. Just be aware that there is a definite difference in writing a tutorial when you have voices you can use or when you don't have them. So when you do a tutorial, think about that difference and see how you can make it the most optimal for your game. Working with actors. We're nearing the end of all of my tips and tricks. Working with actors is obviously specifically for when you're working with voice dialogue. Now, when you're doing this, maybe for the first time, or you haven't worked with actors before, or maybe you're a writer or narrative designer who will write voiced dialogue, but you won't work with the actors yourselves. Somebody else will do that. It's still going to be beneficial for you to either be present when it's recorded or maybe get some table reading going on before recording with actors or people in your studio who have like amateur experience in acting or whatever. Anybody who can basically read and act out your words is going to be useful for you. So please do that. In working with actors, there's going to be a lot of reactions from the players as soon as your game is released that you might not have recognized when you were working on it. One of the big things that I've come to realize is that players have different reference points, especially when the game they're playing is not their native language. So basically this means that I've worked on games where like some players would say like, oh, these are like the best voice actors ever. And others would say, wow, they sound like they're really amateurish and really bad. Often this has to do with whether it's their own native language they're playing in. So basically, if you're not native English speaking, but you do play a game in English, you might hear something entirely different because your reference points are different. Try not to worry about that, but I just want you to be aware that this can happen. Actors have their speech preferences as well. So it can be that you wrote a line that you can just speak perfectly, and an actor might have trouble with that. Doesn't mean your line is bad, doesn't mean the actor is bad. It's just that we all have preferences in, for instance, the order of words in a sentence, or we have small, well, I wouldn't call it speech impediments, but just things that make one word harder than another word. Don't worry about small adjustments. I know that a lot of writers, especially if you haven't worked with actors before, will feel really protective about their own lines. Try to be open to what the actors are doing. There's nothing wrong with small adjustments, as long as it's still the same intention. as long as the words that you need, for instance, for puzzles are still in there. When in doubt, in general, trust the actor, because you want them to act as natural as possible. It's their work. So please be open to their suggestions, but do stay on top of it, because in the end, it's your game, it's your words, and you don't want an actor to just run off with it. And then later on, when you get back and you hear the words and you put them in the game, you're like, wow, this is really going in a different direction than I wanted to. But please trust their work and trust their ideas and their way of speaking, because all of that will make it more natural and eventually lots better. Voice and written text, just a small note on this, because if you have voice dialogue, you often will also have the written text. You can do this for a certain number of reasons. Decide what your text is and who it's for. So basically, often you will have subtitles. I hope so, because that is great for accessibility. I already mentioned there are rules for subtitling for TV and film. So if you've never done something like that, look it up, or just hire somebody to do your subtitles who is used to doing that. It will really help you. If you have closed captions, that means it's subtitles plus the information about other sounds. Closed captions are perfect for anyone who has a hearing disability. So if you have closed captions, you will have subtitles plus something extra. Again, there's rules for this. People who use subtitles, for instance, not because they have a hearing impediment, but because they want to make sure they don't miss anything, or because they play a game in not their native language, they will often find closed captions annoying, because they want the subtitles, but they don't want the extra information. So look at the two images I have here. The left one is the closed captions and the right one is the subtitles. If you have the possibility to have either subtitles or closed captions as an option, that would be awesome. But I get that this is not always possible. But please think about that at least and make an informed decision about that. Decide if it's optional or not. So can you turn it on and off, the subtitles? And also decide whether you need it verbatim. So this example here is again from Old Frequencies, because Old Frequencies is only text and no characters to show, no animations or whatever. To us, it was important to have all of the text verbatim. So no closed captions, but everything in there. Also the uhs, ahs, cuffs, whatever, things like that. Because if you hear text and you don't see anything, you will easily get distracted if the words on the screen aren't exactly what you're hearing. So whenever an actor did like one small word different or whatever, we really had to put that in. Took a lot of time, but it was really useful because that is also part of the experience of the player. I can imagine that this is, if you've never done something like this is far too short for me to explain. But if you have any questions about these kind of things, do let me know or do some research. I just want to mention it here because it's something that a lot of game designers don't really think about until the last minute. So think about this, get a UX person involved as well, to make sure that you know what you're doing. Okay, tips and tricks. So I already said read comics if you used to working with actors and now you have to write dialogue and you won't have actors. Comics are a great way to get to know how to write. It really helped me. If you're going the other way around, so you've done a lot of written text, but you've never worked for acting before, you can compare books and film adaptations because there are a lot of books that have been made into TV series or films that have partly the dialogue from the book exactly in it, and partly they don't. Comparing the differences, like why did they use this written dialogue and why was this line changed? And I'm not talking about the whole plot that you obviously have to change sometimes when you make a film adaptation, but just mainly the dialogue. Try to compare and see which lines do and don't work and why they were changed. That's really useful. And obviously, read your work aloud, do it yourself, make other people do it, grab some friends, do a table read, anything to hear your lines aloud, anything to hear other people struggle with lines and words that you think are really useful and really logical, because everybody has different speech patterns. And hearing people's speech patterns will help you enormously. Listen, listen, listen. Don't copy conventions. I mentioned it before. If you want somebody with a specific background, make sure you do your research, ask people, listen to how people speak, and please use diverse voices. There are so many options to use diverse voices in gaming. In casting your characters, casting your actors, please think about this. Think about diversity, not just for the benefit of the whole industry, but also for the benefit of your story, because the more diversity you have within the voices in your story, the more interesting and the easier it will be for players to connect to that. We all have different backgrounds, we all have different speech patterns, we all have different conventions. Having diverse characters, having diverse sounds, diverse speech patterns, diverse ways of talking, and also diverse ways of writing down how people speak will really help liven up your story and get as many players involved as you can. That was it. Thank you very much. It's been a lot in a small amount of time. I really hope that you found something useful in here, or at least find something in there that makes you think about those differences and assess your own game with that in your mind. Again, feel very free to contact me wherever with questions, remarks, or anything like that. Thank you very much for listening to me today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.